Hi, Karl Sakas here, agency consultant, and welcome to Agency Office Hours for June 2021. Today, we'll be answering 4 questions from agency leaders like you about running their agency more smoothly. We have a theme this month around teams, agency culture, and getting more done with what you have. Here's a preview of the questions we'll be answering today. Andrea in Ontario, Canada has a question about agency culture. Jorge in California has a question about hiring. Rachel in New York has a question about employee retention, especially amidst COVID and post-COVID. And finally, Suzanne in South Carolina has a question about productivity and efficiency. If you're one of the 4 people I mentioned, be ready to unmute yourself and come on video if you're not already for your question in that order. And if I didn't mention you and you have a question that you'd like to ask in a future event, be sure to include that when you RSVP. And if you're joining live, we've shared the link for that on chat. If you're watching the recording, you can see the registration link in the description. As usual, we are recording office hours today, so don't share anything out loud that you don't want to become public. If you're watching live, you'll get this video via email within 24 hours. Our first question today from Andrea in Ontario is about agency culture. Andrea, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and welcome. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Andrea, and I am the founder of Horseshoe & Co. We are a HubSpot consulting agency, as Karl mentioned, in Ontario, Canada. So my question is about building out a team of contractors and freelancers as opposed to full-time employees. I'm definitely recognizing the benefit in doing that, but I'm struggling to build a team culture around, especially in Canada, at least, we have some particular legal implications in that you can't treat a contractor or freelancer the way that you would with a full-time employee in terms of the demands that you make. So just trying to navigate those waters and finding it tricky to be able to build a team culture while still abiding by those legal implications and really make a non-team feel like a team. So I'd love to hear from Karl and from anyone else that can weigh in on how they've potentially achieved that.
Glad to help. And for everyone listening, if this is something you've worked through at your agency, please feel free to chime in on chat and share what's worked for you or where you're finding challenges. So ultimately, Andrea, to answer the question, part of it is around hiring contractors who think about being part of a team rather than they're just there to do the job that you've hired them to do. Part of that's attitude. It also includes how you structure their agreement. For instance, one of my recommendations is if you have contractors, give them an additional budget each week or each month to work on things to improve the agency. That is unrelated to client billable work you might be doing and unrelated to any other internal things they might be doing as sort of their standard job. The idea there is that you want them to be thinking about finding ways to help the agency. You also need to pay them for it, right? I had a client a few years ago say, well, do I really need to pay contractors to come to like sort of the team update meeting? I'm like, yeah, like their presence is helping them be more plugged into the agency, and that's going to help you in the long run. But of course, some of that is finding the right people in the first place. My experience is when I've hired contractors, and in the US, there's a similar challenge around those certain guidelines about what you can and can't do. My goal is to hire people who are entrepreneurial, who take initiative, who are smart and get things done, but who tend to be invested rather than just seeing this as, they're doing this for an hourly rate and that's it. Part of that includes, showing people that you care, asking them how things are going outside of work, asking how their pets are doing, how their family's doing, that kind of thing, rather than just, well, where's the deliverable? That same idea of warmth and competence that you can use, with any team member. So part of it's hiring people right. Part of it is making sure there's budget for them to go above and beyond. And then beyond that, you also want to keep them in the loop about what's going on. If someone's not at, for instance, every daily stand-up, or they're not at every weekly team meeting, what can you do to keep them updated? And this is a challenge for many agencies where, regardless of the model, the leadership team is discussing things, making decisions, and then they tell the team, and often people wonder, why isn't the team on board with it? Well, the leadership team spent weeks or months, or at least days, talking about it before rolling it out. For the team, they're hearing it for the first time. So you need to make sure you communicate what's going on. One way to do that might be through, depending on the right choice for agency culture, sort of an internal newsletter. Here's what's coming on. Celebrate client wins, grieve client losses. Depending on the client, maybe celebrate client losses, depending on the circumstances. Andrea, what's your reaction to those points?
Those are all great. And they're so basic. I'm sure I've heard that advice individually in different places or from different people, but never really cohesively looked at them as like a roadmap, So I've heard time and time again, like, hire the right people. Of course, you want to hire the right people.
Yeah.
But it's keeping in mind that hiring contractors does give you potentially an opportunity to expand that role and build out that role. So I've just written down basically everything that you said. And I guess where, that works both going forward and retroactively, right? For hiring next time, of course, I've got a clearer understanding of what I need to do. But for the existing contractors, it's really just keeping them in the loop and treating them like they are full-time employees, but of course not infringing on any laws here in Canada.
A way to think of it would be they need to feel valued rather than just being a mercenary or hired gun. There are freelancers where that is their approach, right? That was the origin of the term freelance, right? Someone who is a soldier for hire kind of thing it's probably medieval times. So there are obviously a lot of moving parts. One of the other bits to consider, and this is true for you, Andrea, and for everyone listening, are there certain qualities that you find you need in the team or that you want to avoid in the team? For instance, a client who had mostly full-time people had a problem where they had team members that we sort of in executive coaching, we shorthanded these team members as misanthropic loners. Like, they didn't like other people and they wanted to work on their own. Well, that's not a good approach for an agency. But when I asked, are you screening to not hire misanthropic loners? The answer was like, well, no, we weren't looking for that. That'll happen. So now when they interview people, both full-time and freelancers, they'll ask things like, tell about a time when you had a disagreement with a team member. What happened? What is your ideal team structure? And, things like that, to get a sense for how do they feel about being on a team. Because and the ideal candidate's going to be asking you about the current team. For instance, when I started as an agency PM, when I moved from one agency to another, a decade ago, before accepting the job offer, I made a point of saying, I'd like to speak with my future team members. Because I'm thinking to myself, as a project manager, I'm highly dependent on their competence and just what it's like to work with them. If they're incompetent, I'm not going to get anything done. I ultimately talked with most of the team members within like a day or so. I'm like, this sounds good, and I accepted. Andrea, any other bits as you're sorting through what to do next?
I'm just looking through some of the comments here in the chat, and I think this is a really clear strategy. So no, I think I'm good. Thanks, Karl, and everyone else who's commented in here.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And Boris, thank you for your comment in chat. You mentioned that it takes time to make people feel like they're part of the team, and that's a great point. If someone is a freelancer, are they filling gaps between full-time jobs, or is their goal to have an independent lifestyle and seek a long-term relationship? Obviously, people can say all kinds of things. But in general, I am a fan of hiring people who are full-time freelancers because although obviously they've got multiple clients they're working with, if you're like, I need to schedule a meeting next week, they're not having to coordinate it with their day job. Although, fun fact, I was talking to a friend who worked on Madison Ave in the late 70s, early 80s. Kind of imagine like at the end of when the characters in Mad Men would have been retiring. And he mentioned, like the closed office door. He said that usually meant that, he was working on, or someone was working on their freelance projects for their freelance clients outside of their agency job where they were working. And I said, wasn't your boss concerned about that? He said, no, he was doing his own freelance projects. There we go. And Kat, if you could share my article on moonlighting policies. I am a fan of letting your employees freelance, but the key is to have some boundaries. Coming up next, we have a question from Jorge. Jorge, if you want to unmute yourself and all that, we'll answer your question. And Bet, thank you for your note in chat. We really look for people who are good at communicating. Contractors who can't communicate well bring lots of issues. I think we could extend that even further. Anyone who can't communicate well, there are going to be all kinds of issues. It's just a question of when they will, rear their head. Well, Jorge, welcome.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for having me here again. My question kind of relates a little bit to what Andrea was talking about. Let me give a little bit of context. So we, for the past 10 plus years, had a problem client, what we call a problem client, and Carl knows a little bit about this client. And about a month ago or a month and a half ago, we fired them because after 10 years, we realized that they were just dragging us back instead of lifting us and pushing us forward.
Yes.
So after much deliberation, we were able to get rid of them. And but with that, because it was so much busy design and production work, we had a couple of designers, working all the time, pretty much on only this account. But once they were gone, we both designers pretty much kind of like went away on their own will. So we ended up without a designer.
Mm.
Nevertheless, we still keep getting design work, not as much busy work as before, but we still keep getting design work. So now, me having that design background, I'm having to pick up on that with the help of some freelancers. But also I have this other stuff that, as the executive or one of the executives of the business, I have to do. Because I don't have anybody else to, do it. So
Right.
I also need help with that. So my question kind of like has two parts to it. The first one is I've been thinking about just keeping the design position as a freelance position. Not necessarily having to hire someone as an employee, and obviously having someone with the competence that I need. I need someone that is very well versed in logo design and web design. And but I also, on the other side, I also need someone to help get off my plate that busy admin work, maintain my calendar, help me, answer simple emails, help me pay some bills that just come from freelancers themselves.
Right.
We do have an accountant, but this person is an accountant. She is not our everyday pay this bill here and there. So like all these different busy admin stuff that I don't have the time to do, and just gets in the back burner, and then all of a sudden a fire happens and I'm like, oh, I didn't pay this, I didn't do this, I didn't answer, I didn't follow up, I didn't.
Right.
So the question is, for the designer, would it be smart to keep it as a freelancer and on maybe an as needed basis? And second, which one should I, if I don't decide to keep it on an as needed basis, but still as a freelancer, but work on my time, which one should come first, the designer or the VA? Or, well, not a VA, an assistant, just an assistant.
Let's take a look at that. So to summarize, it sounds like you have two core needs. You have design, which fluctuates somewhat, and you also need administrative support, whether that's staffed by a virtual assistant or another team member. Whenever it comes to staffing in general, one of the things around full-time versus freelancer is to consider what is the workload on a roughly weekly basis. My guideline is that if you have 20 hours or more of a particular type of thing, you should probably hire a full-time person for a couple reasons. One, as you get toward a full-time schedule, legally, you're supposed to classify them as an employee. The government wants their payroll taxes. So, if you have someone doing 30 to 40 hours a week, that's kind of hard to justify as a contractor, unless you're running through a staffing firm. Also, you're going to end up spending less money, right? You tend to pay a freelancer twice as much per hour as you would pay them as an employee. Sometimes that's totally fine. If you need 5 hours a week of something, pay twice as much per hour as a full-time person, you're still going to pay less than a full-time person if you only need 5 hours. But as you approach 15 and you get to 20 hours a week, it really makes sense to hire full-time because you'll pay the same amount per year, roughly, and get double the hours. So on the design question, I think the big thing there is what is the forward-looking trajectory on hours? If it's at least 20 every week, probably makes sense to hire full-time. For the part one question, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Then the other question around the administrative support, to me, that doesn't sound like the same person. People don't go to design school to pay, accounts payable, pay invoices from people. The good news is there are people who really enjoy managing details like that and getting things off your plate. And that probably is a virtual assistant. There's a question of whether you need a full-time assistant, whether someone part-time would make sense. Some of it depends on the mix of what they're doing. But if for instance, it's less than 20 hours a week, or it's more like 5 or 10 hours a week, virtual probably makes sense. Your question then becomes, do you hire a virtual assistant directly, or do you hire them through a VA agency? There are pros and cons to both of that. If you're hiring directly, you're paying less per hour because you're hiring them directly as a contractor. If you go through a VA agency, you can probably find someone faster. They've got a stable of pre-vetted people, and they're pre-vetted, and usually the VA agency, the virtual assistant agency, builds in some sort of a backup plan, right? They're on vacation. They've got someone who's plugged into their systems and perhaps your systems to step in, so you have continuity. There are pros and cons. I think the right answer depends on a mix of what is your budget and how do you prefer to work. What's your reaction to that, Jorge?
I think this makes sense. I hadn't actually really thought about that. What's the trajectory of either position? That's a good thing to think about. We had thought about the amount of hours per week, that each position would be allocated, but that trajectory question we hadn't thought about that quite yet. But I guess what stems out of it is the whole purpose of as an executive of to have your employees is so you can free up your time to grow the business. Which one, in your experience, would you think should come first? I mean, this is the chicken and the egg question, right?
Right. As the owner, you ideally think of your time being worth $1,000 an hour. Now, you may not necessarily bill it at $1,000 an hour, but I think that helps you frame what should you be doing versus what should someone else do. for people listening live, Kat has shared my article on finding the cheapest competent available person. That is, when you've got two people available to work on something, assuming they're both competent, they're both available, you should probably assign it to the person who is at a lower hourly rate, all things considered. Of course, if only one is available, you go with that person. If only one is competent, you go with that person, kind of regardless of the price. So for you, Jorge, and for everyone listening, as an agency leader or owner, you are the most expensive person at your agency, or you and your business partners, if you have business partners, in the sense that you're doing things that perhaps no one on the team could do, or maybe, that's not the highest value thing for them to do. So for instance, Jorge, you could do the graphic design, but you could also, for instance, be doing a networking meeting with a potential referral partner. You could outsource the design work to a freelancer or to an employee. You're probably not going to outsource the networking meeting with a fellow agency CEO, president, what have you. On the other hand, there are some things that may be lower value, but you just enjoy doing. For instance, I enjoy shipping things to clients. When a potential or new client is joining, they get copies of my books and some bonus surprises. I enjoy doing that. And also because I'm hand signing the books and I'm handwriting the note, logistically, it doesn't make sense since I work remotely, to get that over to a team member and what have you. And I also bundle things together. I have an area set up for mailing and things like that. It's technically not $1,000 an hour, but to me, I think of it as relationship building versus just blasting out, unpersonalized things. And if you're a client, there's even more stuff to come, but those will be surprises for people if you haven't received something yet. So Jorge, any follow-up questions based on what we covered?
I think this is amazing. This high value versus the low value activities. Awesome.
So glad to hear it. Well, let us know how it goes. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much, Karl. You're amazing as always.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, coming up, we have a question about employee retention during COVID from Rachel. And then we'll look at how to improve team productivity, question from Suzanne. But first, a word from our sponsor, me, Sakas and Company. In my work, I focus on helping agencies all over the world grow more profitably. So far, it's been over 400 agencies one-on-one on every continent except Antarctica. And when the penguins get an agency, we will be there to help. All right. So I've got a bonus tip for you before we go into the last two questions. If you've got a strategy, that's good. A strategy for your agency overall, maybe for your own marketing, to fix the shoemaker's kids problem, could be a strategy for your client. But there's a catch. You still need to implement it. And that's where, the rubber meets the road. If you follow EOS, for instance, and you're the visionary, you know that you need an integrator to help you implement your plans. Now, I've identified 10 tips to help you turn your strategy into an implementation plan based on the work I do with clients in my agency roadmap projects and in my custom consulting projects. And there are 10 steps, and if you're listening live, you'll see those in chat. But I want to highlight tip number 6 out of the 10 so that everyone has that. And this is the tip. When you are implementing a strategy at your agency, be sure to consider the change management implications for the stakeholders involved. Stakeholders would include members of your team, would include both employees and contractors, as well as any owners, you and any others who own the agency. It also includes your clients, includes your prospective clients, and it includes the people that provide services and products to your agency. Now, different strategies will impact different stakeholders in different ways, but ideally, before you go out and launch things, I would make a list, create an inventory of all of the stakeholders that the changes will impact, and then assess, what do you think their reaction is going to be? You can actually group them into 4 categories. You can code them or map them into 4 stakeholder categories. First one is champions. Who are the people that are going to be championing the change? Typically, that's going to be about 10% of the total population. Helpers, 20%. Helpers are there to support the champions in making things happen, but the helpers are not necessarily leading the change. Your biggest chunk are going to be bystanders, about 60% of the overall group. Bystanders, aren't necessarily opposed, but they aren't necessarily in favor. They're going to wait and see how things go. Bystanders, 60%. And finally, resistors, 20%. Resistors are people who are actively opposing the change. Now, based on academic research, those percentages tend to hold true for a wide range of organizations. Of course, if your agency has 5 people today, obviously the percentages are going to be a bit skewed since you can't have a 10% when there are only 5 people. And, even if you're larger, 10, 25, 50, 100 people or more, every business is going to be different. The point of coding people by those categories, champions about 10%, helpers about 20%, bystanders around 60%, and resistors around 20%, is that you can sort through, how do you need to enlist your middle managers to help you persuade people to move forward? Do you need to take some extra time to persuade some of your middle managers to be on board? Because if they're not on board, they're going to be projecting that to their team, and so on. Keeping an eye on the future, your plan needs to include how you'll announce the changes within your agency and to others, and also how you'll share ongoing updates. For instance, a client made a number of strategic changes, announced what was going on, and then a few months later, their team was like, well, okay, what's the status on that? They hadn't communicated it to the team. Change management can be a delicate thing, especially when you try to improve things too quickly. So be careful about trying to change too much at once. And certainly don't announce a big initiative without a concrete plan to keep people updated about what's going on. So that is the bonus tip, thanks to Sakas and Company. If you've got a big change coming up, a big strategy, as you create the implementation plan, be sure to include change management in the process. You're going to get better results overall. And if you'd like my one-on-one help going through whether it's creating a strategy or figuring out how to roll out a strategy or sorting through change management on the strategy of your agency, please get in touch. I would love to help. There's a link on chat, or you can go to sakasandcompany.com, SAKS, the word company.com for more. All right, Karl Sakas here. Thank you. Next up, we have a question about employee retention. This is a question from Rachel in New York. Let me go ahead and bring you on here. Rachel, thank you for joining. Appreciate your being here.
Thanks for having me. I think my question probably goes along well with Andrea's first question, and that is that we are losing people to remote large companies and the growth of the freelance creative economy just in general. What's your perspective on what's going on in the world here?
You are not alone in facing that problem. Early in the pandemic, I predicted that more and more employees are going to be working remotely, and that existing employees would basically be coming to you to say, I want to work remotely or else. So, it is definitely a trend and a pattern. Some of that's going to depend on the individual. There are some employees who prefer to work as a full-time in-office team member, if that's their preference. But certainly the pandemic is making people think about their priorities. For some of them, maybe that's joining a larger company. For some of them, it's working remotely, whether it's for you or someone else. And for some people, maybe they've had a dream of doing their own thing, and now is the time. One of my past team members did that, where she realized, what? Her dream has always been to have her own business, her own agency, and she went to make that happen. And the pandemic was a key catalyst in that change. So this is part of a broader trend. Of course, the question is, what do you do, right? If you've got a great team member who is either leaving or thinking of leaving or maybe susceptible to hearing from recruiters, what do you do? Well, a few things to keep in mind. One, accept that remote is here to stay to varying degrees. I have some clients where I've helped them go 100% virtual. I would say that most agencies are not going 100% virtual. There's more of a leaning toward a hybrid approach. On the other hand, I wouldn't recommend that an agency, if they were physically 100% in a physical office, I'm not sure I'd recommend you double down on that. Though, if that's what you want, you can. You're going to limit the people who join your team. The other thing to consider, and this is true for you, Rachel, and for everyone listening, consider your strengths as a relatively smaller agency, right? In my work, I'm not working with agencies that have, thousands of people. If you don't have thousands of people, you are a smaller agency. Ad Age defines the cutoff at 150 people or fewer. So if you have under 150, you are a, quote, smaller agency. There are a lot of strengths to being a smaller agency. And so part of your job is to connect with people who see small agency strengths as strengths rather than weaknesses. For instance, if you're at a small agency, team members are going to be working regularly with the owner or owners and the leadership team. That's great if someone wants to take initiative and wants to get things done and wants to feel that they have a voice in bigger decisions. On the other hand, if you have an employee who just wants to keep their head down and not get too much attention, they're not going to be a good match at a small firm, agency or otherwise. And maybe they need to leave. This is true when hiring. If you have a candidate who's at a large company now, they need to understand that there are going to be fewer resources. They're going to have likely more autonomy than they did at the large corporation. But for instance, there isn't the same level of administrative support. There isn't, an office to book their travel and things like that. So the ideal is to find people who see working at a smaller agency as a plus. Access to management, autonomy to make a difference. They're probably going to get promoted faster than at a larger firm where things are, sort of crustier. With that in mind, Rachel, what is coming to mind in terms of some benefits that would attract the right person and would, repel the wrong person, specific to your firm?
Definitely your suggestion about having access to the leadership would definitely be a positive. The ability to affect change and really bring the clients to another level. Being a specialist, we really like people who are specialists and want to just grow that specific thing that they're looking into. They want to do better at it. They want to collaborate with others. Sure.
Yes. It's also an opportunity for many people to do, there's a bit more variety. Agency life inherently tends to have a lot of variety. You've got multiple clients. But, if we think about my agency roles model, the 6 agency roles, AM, PM, SME, strategist, biz dev, and support, odds are someone's going to be doing a bit of 2 or 3 jobs, sometimes even more, depending on the size of the agency. If someone, for instance, wants to do account management, keep the clients happy and sell them more work, and strategy, they can at a smaller agency. In contrast, if they're working at an agency with 100 people, 150 people or more, they're going to do one. They're going to do account management or strategy. So it's an opportunity for the right person. On the other hand, if someone wants to specialize, a small agency may not be the right choice. So, the key thing here, we talked earlier about doing a change management assessment, looking at stakeholders. I would recommend that Rachel, and for everyone who's listening, make a list of your team and sort through, is our future direction likely a match for this person? If the answer is no, then you need to decide what to do. Maybe it's preparing to lose them. Maybe if someone is sort of a mediocre employee, you could reinforce what's coming up and have a frank discussion about whether that's a match for what they want or not. And if need be, help them find a new job, let them move on. And if someone, say, is enthusiastic about the changes coming up, make sure they're in the loop about what's happening so that they know that, you know, they're aligned and you want them to be involved in your future, that the agency's future and their future can align. Rachel, any questions on that?
Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering if there's anything new and different maybe some of the other folks here are doing that are helping with employee retention, or ways that they're now going from a place where you really had mostly full-time people and now you've got more part-time people, and now you have to manage those part-time or freelancers, and it just brings a whole other layer of management in a different way that we're not used to.
Absolutely. And and definitely for anyone who has an insight on that, please share in chat. One of the things to consider is that a lot of agencies have an operations manager or someone in an operations role, maybe a project manager, who is the primary point of contact for managing and hiring freelancers. That is, maybe someone is a designer, maybe they're a full-time designer, and they're like, you know what, I want to go to freelancing. They probably will now get managed by someone else. They might get managed by the creative director or director of strategy or something like that, but potentially they might shift. So it is worth considering that the way you've managed people before, may not work now if someone moves to a freelance role. And indeed, that, to answer your part 2 question, what do you do if employees are thinking of switching to full-time freelancing? Some people, they're going to do it. Whether you want them to leave or not, they're committed to making it happen. It may be worth sharing my article on how to start an agency. Kat has shared that in chat. Starting a freelance practice has a lot of similarities to starting an agency. It's hard, right? When I hear from agency owners who are reaching out for my consulting or coaching help, I'll ask, why did you start your agency, start or join your agency, and how has it worked out compared to what you expected? And often there's a theme that people were like, I worked at an agency and my boss was making, these stupid decisions, and I'm like, I could do it better. But what people have often found is, maybe there was a reason their boss was making those stupid decisions. Like, things are harder than people thought once they're now in charge of everything. And you may find that some people discover that the grass is not greener, right? Where they start doing freelancing and want to come back. You have to decide if it's right to take them back or not. Sometimes people need to experience it for themselves, no matter what you say. And of course, if you're trying to persuade someone to stay, there's an inherently a conflict of interest, right? If you're like, well, stay. And they're like, well, I know you want me to stay, but I want to go. In that case, the other advantage of employees going from full-time to becoming a freelancer, assuming they've had a good experience as an employee, and assuming that they have a good experience as a freelancer, and assuming the agency isn't, mean to them in the transition, they're an important referral source for you in the future. Maybe they're meeting people in their work who'd be great future employees. Maybe they're working with companies that could use your agency's help. Maybe, things that maybe they're working for a while and the workload keeps expanding and they're like, oh, I don't want a client concentration problem. Maybe it's time to recommend, they hire my old agency. And that's only going to happen if they have a good experience as an employee and during the transition. So I would say if someone wants to go, let them go, and try to do it as, smoothly and, nicely as possible. All right. Well, Rachel, thank you very much for your question. We have one more question coming up. This will be a question from Suzanne. Suzanne, thanks for joining. Let me bring you in here. There we go. All right. Suzanne, hello. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Well, thank you for including my question.
Absolutely. Well, to paraphrase, here is the question, Suzanne, that you asked. You said, how can we use our current software tools to improve efficiency and productivity? Great question. If you could, please elaborate a bit.
Well, I'm new to the agency and our specialty is medical devices. So it's been a fairly steep learning curve in the last 2 weeks. I'm trying to assess what we do, what our clients do, how we can service them, who the team is. And we have a small core team and then an auxiliary team of what they call curated freelancers. And then we use several subscription services. So trying to figure out who gets what channeled to them is also part of the learning curve. And how we use Basecamp, we use Google Sheets for status meetings, and we use Harvest for timekeeping. So I need to assess how those work together. Are we integrating it best? And I've just come from a graduate program where I'm all in love with Kanban boards and stand-up meetings and trying to figure out how much agile and how much waterfall we have here and how to create the most efficient hybrid approach. So
it's an exciting time and also
it is exciting.
a lot.
It's a lot of information.
Yeah. So I would start by doing an inventory of what are the tools you have, what are the resources you have. The odds are there are some things that, people are using all the time. There are other things that they're barely using.
Yes, and everyone has their favorite things, but I don't know that we're using them to their full capacity.
You're not alone in that. And I think some of it becomes, are there circumstances where maybe something that you don't use very often, but it adds a lot of value when the time comes. For instance, for many agencies, that's a subscription to sort of an SEO or SEM management tool. SEMrush, Moz, Raven Tools, things like that, where you might be paying a relatively hefty amount each month, but you're able to automate your reporting so that someone isn't having to manually create the reports every month. In my first job at a social impact mutual fund, one of my jobs was to create quarterly market share reports. We'd get data from an outside company. I follow the directions and process them a certain way. And the person who assigned me was basically like, here's the instructions. It takes 2 weeks. 2 weeks every quarter? Like 80 hours-ish of work? That's a lot of work. So I followed her directions the first time. And then the next quarter, I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. So I did it the second time. And I was thinking about the process. How could I make this better? And one of the things I did was I spoke with the stakeholders who received the report, the CEO, the chief investment officer, and the COO, and was asking, how do they use it? What's helpful? What's not? It turned out some pieces in the report they didn't look at all. There were other things that weren't as useful. There's some things they wanted to add. Okay, great. I then went back to the data company that provided the data to us. And I said, is there any way to slice and dice things a bit differently? And it turned out either my predecessor didn't know or didn't act on it. We actually had a consulting budget with them each time so that they actually could do slicing and dicing for us. We were already paying for it. We just weren't using it. Ultimately, I was able to turn the process from 2 weeks, 10 days. I was able to cut it 80% to 2 days. Yeah. Now, you may not be able to find that kind of saving, but it is worth considering that even expensive software can still enable a lot in saving on labor. So it's worth considering, what are the pros and cons, what are the benefits and the costs. But start by doing an inventory. What do you use now? How?
I have asked everyone on the team. What do they like, what they don't like, etc.
Exactly. And one thing you might do is ask people, but then maybe cross-reference to your P&L statement, profit and loss, to see where is the money going out. A client recently mentioned, I recommended he do an audit of things finance-wise, and he found a $6,000 a month recurring expense that he didn't need, but that they were paying.
Yikes.
Just stopped that now. $72,000 a year. I mean, that'll help him hire a new team member instead. So, do be careful about switching for switching's sake. And this is
Right.
true for you, Suzanne, and for everyone who's listening. There are major switching costs as people have to get up to speed on the new software and things like that, and you potentially lose data along the way, or other things happen that create problems. And it is normal to use multiple tools. For instance, to use one tool for project management, sometimes another tool for invoicing, sometimes another tool for something else. And usually the big decision there is, do you want to use best in class, like they are the best at that thing, or do you want to combine things? And when you combine things, you lose out in some areas, right? It may not be the best invoicing tool, but it's great for other aspects of project management. Or maybe, it's okay for project management, but the client communication piece is really good. You have to weigh what is right for you. And for those
Right.
listening on chat, Kat has shared links to my article on PM software selection in 22 not so easy steps. You can use that general process really for any kind of software tool. Amidst all of this, I would also consider your estimation process. A lot of agencies are like, should we switch to value-based pricing? Maybe, but I would start by looking within your existing pricing model. There's hourly or time and materials, there's milestone or deliverable, and then there's value-based. If you're working on a milestone basis and you keep going over budget, get your estimates better and then manage the scope. Or if you're
What
doing
was the last thing you mentioned? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
What was the last thing you mentioned? I have hourly and milestones for pricing.
Yes, hourly, milestone, and then the final bit is value-based.
Value-based.
Where you're charging more or less based on the result they get. And that is ideal, but I think the thing is, whenever you're thinking about productivity and about systems, it's an opportunity to look for profit leaks, and one of those big ones is going over budget or misestimating it in the first place. So I'd recommend digging into that a bit to sort of sort through that. Suzanne, thinking about what we've covered, what comes to mind, on things you'll take action on from here?
I will take action on considering the switching costs more. I appreciated in the last slide when you were talking, I think it was Rachel, about adding things on and what the costs are and who might amongst the stakeholders be champions, who might be helpers, who might be resistors. So those things have all resonated with me, but I will take action on the switching costs right away. And I've pretty much asked everybody on the team and in the auxiliary team about their favorite aspects of what we're using. And, my initial thought was it's not as integrative as I would like, but they all have favorite things about it. And, who am I to argue about their favorite things?
And part of that ultimately becomes, if you decide not to, and that either is your decision or you're lobbying for the decision, part of it is explaining, why, to say, I know you love it. Here are the overall circumstances that mean we have to stop. Depending, you also may need to think about retention aspects. If someone loves a particular program and you're like, I know you love it, but we're switching to something that you hate, or that maybe you're not sure about, but or maybe they've used it before and they don't like it. If that's going to save you $20 a month, but create a lot of ill will, that might be worth just keep paying the $20 a month.
Right. Well, so far only one person's really wedded to one thing we're using, and they had a specific reason for it. So if our newer possible tool can also meet that, specific like that she has, then, we can do a soft opening and training and minimize the disruption.
And I'd recommend involving the team member in the selection process, because she may find,
Absolutely.
wow, it works about the same. And here's all this other stuff that works even better. I mean, she may become even more excited about it than you are.
Right.
So, and great point, Rachel. Thank you in chat, mentioning that you have a lot of experience with Workamajig.
Oh, interesting. Someone else recommended that.
Yeah, the thing about Workamajig is it's a great all-in-one option, right? It'll make everything in the agency from workflow to accounting and things like that. The one catch is that it's kind of like joining a gym. If you sign up and never go or never use the software fully, you're not going to get all the benefits. So that is definitely an all-in kind of thing with Workamajig.
Okay.
Cool. Well,
Thank you.
Suzanne, thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Will these links be available after this video is closed?
Send me an email and we'll sort that out.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining Office Hours this month. This is our monthly event every second Tuesday live. If you have questions you'd like to ask in a future event, please sign up. It is free to RSVP. It's free to join if you just want to listen in. And I'll let you know in advance if I've picked your question for the lineup. Sometimes we also have time to answer more questions as well. Karl Sakas here. Thank you for joining Agency Office Hours and good luck out there.
Thanks so much.